My exclusive interview with the US swimmer attacked by a trans hate mob coming up in just a moment. But first, the clash. And after last week's extraordinary events, things got much worse for the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon over the weekend. A motorhome believed to be owned by her husband Peter Murrell was seized from her mother-in-law's house following the ex-SNP chief executive's dramatic arrest on Wednesday morning. Murrell was eventually released without charge, but investigations continue and serious questions have been raised about how much Sturgeon knew and when. The former First Minister was yesterday forced to finally front up and break her silence about the crisis engulfing her and the party she used to lead.
So that's really all I'm able to say just now, other than I intend to get on with life and my job as you would expect me to.
Can we ask a couple of questions? Is that okay?
One or two, yeah.
What were the police looking for?
Look, I'm not going to comment on the police investigation, and I think you would not expect me to do so.
Hand on heart. Meanwhile, a fresh row has developed in the Conservative Party after their Scottish leader, Douglas Ross, infuriated the Tory party's Westminster HQ by suggesting voters could tactically back Labour to help topple the SNP. Speaking to the Sunday Telegraph, Ross urged people to do what's best for the country, adding, "Where there is the strongest candidate to beat the SNP, you get behind that candidate." But a Tory spokesperson hit back, saying, "This is emphatically not the view of the Conservative Party. We want people to vote for Conservative candidates wherever they are standing, as that's the best way to keep Labour and the SNP out." But what do you think? With Douglas Ross at odds with the Tory HQ, should the Conservative Party and Labour endorse tactical voting in Scotland to finish off the SNP at the next election? Down at gbnews.uk, vote in our poll at GB News on Twitter now. But to debate this, I'm joined by the former Scottish Conservatives leadership candidate, Michelle Ballantyne, the editor of the Scottish Daily Express, Ben Borland, and the former Conservative Minister, Edwina Currie. So, Ben Borland, you actually think what Douglas Ross is saying has quite a lot of merit?
Yes, I do. I think voters in Scotland are well used to tactical voting, and I don't think he was particularly saying that Tory voters should vote for the Labour candidate. I think what he was saying, as you've said there, was that all pro-UK voters should vote for the strongest candidate to beat the SNP. And that goes for Labour voters in those seats where the strongest candidate is a Tory. That goes for pro-UK voters in those seats where the strongest candidate is a Lib Dem. So it's not as simple as saying Tories should vote Labour. He was saying all pro-UK voters should vote for the strongest candidate. And this already happens in lots of seats. I live in East Dunbartonshire, where I routinely, I'm by no means a Lib Dem supporter, but I routinely vote for the Lib Dems to beat the SNP. Labour's only Scottish MP, Ian Murray, is a beneficiary of tactical voting. He's put together a real coalition in Edinburgh South where Conservative voters back Ian Murray, and he's got a majority of nearly 12,000.
Yes, and
so I don't think it's as simple as just saying it's the Tories.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And Edwina Currie, is there not an argument? Look, I know you're a true blue Tory, Edwina. I know you struggle with this concept. But actually, isn't this the one issue? You know, saving the union, isn't that the one issue that is more important than saving the Tory party at this point?
Oh, I don't think they need to worry too much about that. I mean, the SNP is doing an extremely good job at the moment of cutting its own throat, and support for unionism is on the increase, while support for independence, I think, is now dead for at least a generation. That's not the problem. I'm objecting, Dan, on principle and in practice. In principle, you should never, never, never tell your voters to vote for another party, because you know what? They may just go on doing that. And what you should be doing is putting your energies and your efforts into explaining why voting for our side is the best thing, both for Scotland and for the country, for the United Kingdom as a whole. But you've got a practical element there. I mean, it's been welcomed by people like Stephen Kinnock for the Labour Party in London. And guess why? Because Labour holds one seat. The Tories have 6. So it's all to play for Labour. Labour cannot win a majority in the House of Commons without seats in Scotland. So every time a Conservative says to somebody in Scotland, vote Labour, they're saying, vote in Keir Starmer. You know, give him a bit of a push. It's a big, big, big mistake.
Michelle Ballantyne, where do you stand?
Well, I think I actually agree with both of them. I mean, one has to understand what it's like in Scotland. When it comes to voting, it's not just about the political party, it's also about that binary question of separation of the union. And unless you're in Scotland and you really feel that when you go to the polls, when you're talking to the electorate, it's quite hard to understand. So there's an assumption that people who vote SNP want independence. It's not necessarily true. I would say if we went to a referendum right now, we would still vote to stay part of the UK. So what we're arguing about here is whether we get rid of SNP in the Scottish Parliament, whether we dull that constant talk about separation that we live with day in, day out. And I think the idea that tactical voting, and Douglas Ross's comment, is somehow new is absolutely untrue. It is a constant conversation up here, and it is constantly done. So if you look across, Douglas Ross himself holds his seat due to tactical voting. He's only got a majority of 513 votes, and Labour helped him in. You've got, in Perth and North Perthshire, the SNP hold that seat, Pete Wishart, by 21 votes. Yeah. That's all it would take to shift that seat.
I guess what was so significant about this, though, was actually hearing the leader of the Scottish Tories vocalise something which, as you say, may have been going on for a long time. And Ben Borland, look, after the events of the past few days, which have been utterly seismic and utterly devastating, certainly for the SNP, potentially for the legacy of Nicola Sturgeon, although only time will tell. Do you think there's any way the SNP can recover before the next election anyway now?
I mean, they're so far ahead. It's not a case of that they need to recover. I mean, the next Holyrood election isn't till 2026, so that's a long way off. Unless Humza Yousaf, to use a colloquial expression, grows a pair and calls a snap election. The next UK general election is a different story. That's next year, and I think this is where Douglas Ross is coming from. The SNP have 47 MPs at the moment, and what pro-UK Scots and people like me who live up here and are sick and tired of it want to do is get that down to 20 or so. That would be a huge result.
It would be a huge result. Edwina, can I just ask you about Sturgeon at the weekend? Did you see that bizarre behaviour in front of the House where she went out there and said, I can't say anything, but I'm speaking to you anyway, and then sort of had her hand on her heart? What was going on? What's going on? Has Sturgeon lost the plot?
What struck me was that fluffy sweater that she suddenly started to wear. After years and years of seeing her in Margaret Thatcher's suits, it was really quite a sort of, a bit of a blink. And maybe that tells us that the real Sturgeon is no longer the strong woman that she was. We're going to see some big changes over the next few years, not just in the Scottish Parliament elections, which Ben has alluded to, but the most important one is going to be the general election. And it will be a fight not about independence, it'll be a fight about how well the country is run. And by the country, I mean Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole. One of the things that the SNP are rightly criticised for is what a mess they have made of running all the services in Scotland that they have responsibility for under devolution. It shouldn't be too difficult for the Conservatives and the Labour Party to demolish them on those issues alone. And people in Scotland are highly intelligent. They can figure out for themselves if they want to do tactical voting. But we should not be advocating it ever.
OK. Edwina Currie, former Conservative Party Minister, thank you so much too. To the former Scottish Conservatives leadership candidate, Michelle Ballantyne, and before that, the editor of the Scottish Daily Express, great newspaper, Ben Borland. So who do you agree with? Were Douglas Ross at odds with the Conservative HQ? Should the Tories and Labour endorse tactical voting to finish off the SNP? Lou on Twitter writes, the SNP want fake independence because they want independence from the UK, but then they want to join the EU. The Scottish people must reject the SNP. From John, It never works and tactical voting will come back to bite you. And Coleman writes, no, the SNP will finish themselves off on their own steam. They are doing an excellent job so far.